Breakthrough.
You're watching BreakThrough News.
You are indeed watching BreakThrough News, and this is the Freedom Side Live. I'm one of your hosts, Eugene Perrier, here, as always, alongside my co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, great to be back with you.
It's good to be back on with you, Eugene.
Well, it's always my pleasure, of course. Very happy to be here and very happy to be here with all of our viewers. I'll take this opportunity to remind you as you watch on YouTube, now would be as good a time as any to make sure you hit the subscribe button and also make sure you hit the bell so you get the alerts. So that way all the great content that we have coming here from BreakThrough News is coming to you very, very directly. So definitely make sure you hit subscribe and hit the bell. And of course, you can always go to patreon.com/breakthrough news and become a patron. We appreciate all your donations. And of course, if you get the opportunity to, if you can share with whoever is following you on whatever platform, however you can, smoke signal, carrier pigeon, that you are here watching the Freedom Side Live, we would very, very much appreciate that. So we got a great lineup, plenty of things, and everyone who's following you should be following us.
Eugene.
Yes.
I am like now all I have is this mental image of somebody like sending a carrier pigeon.
I would love that. I'm going to be honest to you and our listeners,
BreakThrough
Rania.
News is live on YouTube.
I have actually looked into how to get carrier pigeons, and let me tell you, it's a lot more complicated than you might think. So anybody out there who's watching who can send a carrier pigeon, I don't know, email us or something. I would love to talk to you more about that, but yes.
I mean, how fast does that even work? Like,
I really don't know, to be honest with you. I've only seen it in movies and TV. I just know that it used to be widely used.
like cartoons.
That's true.
Cartoons,
well, you know, in other
Game of
shows.
Thrones.
They used carrier pigeons in war as late as World War I, actually.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's very reliable.
All right. Okay, so I take it back. I take it back.
No, you don't need to take it back. It would be funny if someone actually did try to send a carrier pigeon with this message.
Awesome.
Ghost Dog with Forrest Whitaker. Great movie that involves carrier pigeons. Anyway, long story short, we've got a lot for you here on the show, and that's why I want you to go to great lengths to let people know you're watching it. Obviously, we're going to be talking about NATO and their continued expansion, Swaziland and the struggle that is ongoing there. Yes, Swaziland, last absolute monarchy in Africa, major intense struggle happening there. We're also, of course, going to be talking about the climate disaster that we continue to find ourselves in, and also, of course, the first topic that we want to turn to, which is some of the issues in Palestine, especially as it relates the Israeli assassination of Shireen Abu Akleh, sorry about that, and U.S.-Israeli affairs. And we are very happy to be joined, as we continue the show, by Ali Abunimah, who is the director of the Electronic Intifada, electronicintifada.net, for those of you looking to go check that out. Ali, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thank you, Eugene. It's always a pleasure.
You know, Ali, I'm curious what you're making of where this investigation saga is going vis-a-vis Shireen's assassination. I mean, it seems relatively clear what happened. I mean, obviously the State Department sort of dissembling, but Axios had a report earlier today that now Blinken is telling the Israelis that they want to see some quote-unquote form of accountability. So I don't know. I'm just curious some of your thoughts about where we are right now.
Yeah. Well, on May 11th, early in the morning in Jenin, Shireen Abu Akleh, world famous and beloved and very professional journalist, was assassinated by a sniper with a very accurate headshot. Immediately, Israel tried to blame Palestinians. That narrative quickly fell apart. It became clear very quickly that she was shot by Israeli soldiers who were in the area. There was no exchanges of fire in the area. There were many eyewitnesses, including Shireen's colleagues who were right with her when she was killed. The only people who could have done this, the people who did do it, were the Israeli army. Why they did it, we don't know. We don't know the motive. It's clear she was killed deliberately. Whether they intended to kill a journalist or to kill Shireen Abu Akleh specifically, we don't know that yet. But we do know how she was killed, and the eyewitnesses are clear. Since all of the, yeah.
Well, Ali,
Since all of
I
that,
wanted you. Sorry, go. I wanted you. You're probably going to go into this. I was going to ask you about the recent statement by the U.S. State Department that actually tried to
yes,
place the blame, despite what Eugene just said, tried to actually called it tragic and tried to place the blame on terror attacks against Israelis and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, of like doing whatever it is they do in Jenin,
exactly.
and they had the Can you please talk about the
Yeah,
sort of
yeah.
context around
So,
what was taking
so
place?
I want to get exactly to that. So my point is, all of this became very clear very quickly. And immediately, the goal for both Israel and the United States was never an investigation, never a genuine investigation, never an independent investigation, because they knew what the results would be. They knew the results would find that Israel committed this crime. So the goal from the beginning has been how to get Israel off the hook. So in the meantime, between that State Department statement of last weekend, of July 4th, actually, they issued it on July 4th, and the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, there have been at least 7 credible independent investigations that have been carried out by Israeli human rights group B'Tselem, Al-Haq, the Palestinian human rights group, CNN, Bellingcat, NATO government-funded Bellingcat, not exactly, people who we would generally rely upon, but even they concluded that Israel did it. The Associated Press, the Washington Post, and the New York Times all concluded that Israel did this. At least seven different investigations. The US government pressured the Palestinian Authority to hand over the bullet on the basis that the US is some kind of independent arbiter here. And what they did instead was they issued this statement on July 4th saying, yeah, it looks like the Israelis did it, but we have no reason to believe it was intentional, and the bullet is too mashed up to really find out more. So what are you going to do? What are you going to do? It's tragic. And as you said, Rania, they tried to implicitly blame the Palestinians, not by saying Palestinians shot her. They couldn't get away with that. But to say, well, the Israelis were in Jenin because they have to fight terrorism. So some vague justification. The reality, of course, is that Israeli occupation soldiers have no business in Jenin. They were attacking Palestinians in an occupied territory. And as I said, and all the investigations and the eyewitnesses concluded, there was no fighting in the area. There was no exchanges of fire. This wasn't a crossfire that she was caught in. So the outrage at the crude attempt by the Joe Biden administration and Secretary of State Antony Blinken to try to cover up this crime in such a crude way caused such outrage, particularly, of course, from Shireen Abu Akleh's family, who expressed in very poignant terms their disgust at this American whitewash. I think that's what explains why today Blinken, they leaked through their friendly media sources, through Axios, that Blinken told Israel that the U.S. wants accountability. That doesn't mean anything at all. That's just empty words. What I think it's now 80 members of Congress, and that's pretty remarkable. 80 members of Congress have called for is an FBI investigation into the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, an American citizen. And remember, that's routine around the world. When U.S. citizens are killed in terrorist attacks or different circumstances, the FBI will investigate. And the U.S. will assert jurisdiction in many cases and bring people extradite people to put them on trial. or at the very least insist that the countries where the crime took place put them on trial. The exception seems to be Israel, because Shireen isn't the only US citizen killed by the Israeli army this year even. In January, Omar Assad, a 78-year-old grandfather who spent the last 40 years in Milwaukee, raising a family, running grocery stores, being a good US citizen, retired back home to Palestine, to the West Bank, and was brutally killed by the Israeli army. And his family, too, have been demanding that the US government, the Department of Justice, investigate his killing, because just like in the case of Shireen Abu Akleh, the Israeli government whitewashed it and covered it up and exonerated its soldiers, and the US government has done nothing. And if I can just say one more thing to really tie in Shireen Abu Akleh's murder by Israel. Remember, the United States goes around the world lecturing everybody about the importance of the free press and the media and journalism, and crying about journalists in Hong Kong and in China and in Russia and who knows where else. And look how the US treats journalists. They're willing to allow an American journalist, Shireen Abu Akleh, to be murdered by Israel. They're willing to allow Jamal Khashoggi, a US resident and a Washington Post columnist, to be murdered by the Saudi crown prince. Remember, the CIA concluded that Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi crown prince, personally approved the horrifying murder and dismemberment of Jamal Khashoggi. And these two killings are being brushed under the carpet because Joe Biden is planning a trip to Saudi Arabia and to Israel in a few days' time, and the US wants all this swept under the rug so that when Joe Biden goes to basically beg the Saudis to produce more oil, to bring gas prices down so that the Democrats can avoid a wipeout in November, these journalists' lives have to be sacrificed for that. And let's, of course, remember, very important, Julian Assange, who is being persecuted by the Joe Biden administration. They're trying to put him in prison for the next 175 years for the so-called crime of letting the world know about US war crimes. So I want to put this horrifying attempted cover-up of Shireen's murder into the bigger context of the Joe Biden administration and the United States government's utter contempt for the lives of journalists.
Mm.
You know, you mentioned Joe Biden going to sort of kiss the ring in Saudi Arabia. We also hear that there was this like secret meeting held recently in Egypt between all of these countries that have normalized with Israel, as well as Saudi Arabia, which has not officially done it. Their military heads meeting with the Israelis. You hear talk of a so-called Arab Nato. The U.S. really trying to create this sort of Israeli-led security infrastructure in the region against Iran. I'm curious, what are your comments about the idea of a so-called Arab NATO as it relates to Joe Biden's upcoming meeting in Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, these reports have been floating around for a few weeks. And I mean, what we know for a fact is that it's been, it's an explicit US goal to corral all these client regimes into an alliance against Iran, targeting Iran. And these client regimes, which really have no popular base or viability on their own, are totally dependent on US protection. The new twist here is to openly bring Israel into this alliance. Of course, many of these Arab tyrannies, these US-backed Arab tyrannies, have long been, in covert, not just diplomatic ties with Israel, but even military and intelligence ties. But what they want to do is bring this into the open. So there's been a talk floated of a joint air defense system between Israel and various Gulf regimes. And of course, the King of Jordan recently said that if there was, an Arab NATO, he would be the first to welcome it. So these are all very brittle and fragile regimes which depend on US protection. And I think the fear that some of them have, what's not clear to me is how much of this is coming from the US. I mean, the US already has all these regimes in their pocket. So the US doesn't necessarily need to formalize this in the form of an Arab NATO. The question is how much of this is coming from the regimes themselves who feel that they need some kind of formal guarantees, because as the US fades as an imperial power and regional hegemon, they really have no guarantee that the US will come to their rescue. I think they all took the lesson from what happened in Afghanistan when the American puppet regime of Ashraf Ghani collapsed immediately, and the US was able to do absolutely nothing to prop it up and to save Ashraf Ghani from that Saigon moment. And that's what I think they all fear. They all fear their own Saigon moment. And the idea of an Arab NATO, which of course would have Israeli backing and American backing, the United States would have to be the backbone of such a force, would perhaps provide them with some reassurance that if their people rise up against them, that they would have some backing, or if they were to be attacked, presumably by another state. Although I have no idea who that would be, since Iran has no history of aggression against these states, despite the propaganda, and is in fact under constant attack by Israel, the United States, and their proxies. So I read it as being more about these regimes' fears for their security more than anything else, and really formalizing the full integration of Israel and dominance of Israel over the region.
I think that's an extraordinarily important point. And I mean, I wonder, how you think it impacts on the negotiations around the Iran deal, because at least in the beginning, it seemed that there was some momentum in the Biden administration to try to, see if they could come to terms. I just happened to see Mohammad Morandi talk about what Iran is putting forward. Seems pretty straightforward in that sense, but it feels that the Biden administration is almost now kind of dropped it. Like almost as soon as the Russia-Ukraine conflict started, they went back to their sort of old concept of, maximum pressure and all these other things coming together. Do you think it's because many of their client states are in many ways pressuring them to not enter into any sort of agreement with Iran?
Yeah, I think politics is involved there. I think basically the Biden administration, whether they want to or not, knows that they could sign it's not a question of signing a deal. Let's remember that the United States reneged on the deal. The United States violated the JCPOA, the Trump administration, and Joe Biden said he would return to it and has refused to do so. So it is the US that is out of compliance. And Iran has always expressed its willingness to return and has been negotiating on that basis in good faith. But the Iranian position is very clear and understandable. It's like, what guarantee do we have that, in 2 years' time, when there's a new administration, the US isn't just going to rip it up all again? I think Iran would be foolish to sign a deal without those kinds of guarantees, which I think in the United States could only come in the form of Senate ratification of an international agreement. And we know that that's politically impossible in this country. But the Biden administration doesn't want to say it, doesn't want to admit that they have no intention of rejoining the JCPOA, so they're trying to throw the blame on Iran. And yesterday, Blinken, the Secretary of State, announced a whole raft of new sanctions against Iran, and and made this incredible statement that Iran is refusing to return to compliance, when it was never Iran who left the deal in the first place. And Iran's gradual reduction in compliance is part of the deal. It's Iran's protection mechanism as part of the deal, that if the other parties renege, as the United States has done and also the Europeans have done, because they've broken all their promises to Iran, that Iran has the right, within the terms of the agreement, to reduce its compliance. So if the US wants Iran to return to the deal, what it has to do is the US has to return to compliance. But Joe Biden isn't going to do that. And so he's simply trying now to cast the blame, to blame Iran and say, oh, well, we tried, but Iran, big bad Iran doesn't want to do it. And I think it's very clear as well that from the very beginning, Israel has been pushing, and Yair Lapid, and who's the new prime minister, supposed centrist, and others, they've all been against it. In Israel, there's a consensus against this deal. And so the pressure on the Biden administration from Israel and from the client regimes is also there as well. So I think it's very, someone like Dr. Mohammed Marandi is obviously much more expert on this. But, from me being some steps away, I think I would be very surprised if that deal survives.
Yeah, and speaking, since you mentioned Yair Lapid, and now Israel has once again another prime minister. So I feel like Israel so much in common with Lebanon in that case, just constantly changing governments these days. But he's been kind of running around making these threats against both Iran as well as Lebanon. He went to, he met with the leader of France recently and asked him, please intervene in Lebanon to make sure that they can't explore their own gas fields. They belong to us. Please make sure there's no Iran nuclear deal. And it's just going to mommy and daddy and asking them, to make sure that you get to be the most popular kid in the region. But all that said, and also we are in the summertime. I notice, a lot of people in Lebanon get nervous about the summertime because there's been wars in the summer before. So every summer, everyone's like, oh, there's going to be a war. There's going to be a war. But the Israelis are making a lot of threats. Do you foresee any sort of looming war between the Israelis and Hezbollah or the Israelis and Gaza again? Or do you think for the time being they've been momentarily deterred?
The deterrence is there. And let me come back to that. But what I want to say, which is an important contextual point for this issue, is that the Europeans, have they imposed, the US and the Europeans imposed these massive sanctions on Russia, on Russian oil, and they thought that, they would bring Russia to its knees very quickly, and it has brought them to their knees, while Russian oil revenues, by all accounts, are reaching record levels. And the sanctions seem to have had no real impact on Russia, while European economies are, on the threat of on the edge of the worst catastrophe since World War II, according to German officials, because they're facing the possibility of having to shut down entire industrial sectors of the German economy if the Russian gas supply is further reduced. And Rania, you had that fantastic discussion I highly recommend on your show with Kostas Lapavitsas, the Greek economist and former lawmaker, pointing out that really Germany is the industrial heart of Europe. Other than Germany, Europe really doesn't have much sort of heavy industry. So the catastrophe that is looming there is really great. And they have made this pledge to replace Russian gas completely within X number of years. Whether that's feasible or not, I don't know. But who is key to that? Israel. Because the gas fields in the Eastern Mediterranean is what the EU has its eye on. And so they're talking about, the EU just took this decision, which just shows you how cynical everything is, where they have declared nuclear power and quote unquote natural gas, which makes it sound nice, but it's fossil gas. It's no different than oil. They have declared them to be sustainable and therefore green resources so that they can justify new investments in them. And Israel is central to this. And remember, back in May, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, warned Israel very clearly not to go into the gas fields that are on the disputed boundary, and that Hezbollah would not be afraid to defend the gas fields, that it had the capability to do so. And I think Israel takes those words very, very seriously. And the difficulty for Israel is whether or not there is, Hezbollah has to actually implement that security guarantee for Lebanon's gas fields. The reality is that, if you're an international firm or an insurer who insures that kind of operations, are you going to go in and develop those fields when this very capable, very determined, and very credible military resistance organization, Hezbollah, is saying, we're not afraid to intervene if we have to. Right. So that's why I think there is this renewed focus on Hezbollah, because its defense of Lebanon's gas fields is very credible to them, and it stands in the way, potentially, of this Euro-Atlantic Israeli effort to use Eastern Mediterranean gas to try to replace Russian gas and therefore weaken Russia. So that's the context in which I see those, the Israeli whining and complaints about Hezbollah, because we know that Israel cannot defeat. Yes, we know Israel can inflict horrifying damage on Lebanon. They've done it so many times, but they cannot defeat Hezbollah militarily. And they know that the price of attempting to do so, or the price of once again destroying Lebanon, is that Israel will suffer destruction on a scale that it has never experienced before. And even if it can inflict similar damage on Lebanon, it will pay a price that I think Israel is, as of yet, not willing to contemplate. That said, it's not as if these people are master chess players, and time and again, they, through viciousness or stupidity, blunder themselves into wars with catastrophic circumstances, and there's never a guarantee that that won't happen, unfortunately.
Yeah, no. Well, as always, Ali, really appreciate your analysis on all these different fronts. And as I always say, couldn't recommend the work you all do at the Electronic Intifada any higher. But thank you so much, Ali Abunimah, for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rania, I hope there isn't a war. You're right there in the crossfire in the front line.
Well, so if there is, yeah.
Yeah,
if there is,
we'll
I'll
have
be here
good
to tell
coverage.
you what's happening.
I'm not that cynical or that bloodthirsty, as it were, for followers that I would wish.
If there's a war, you
on
guys, there may be one Eugene per year behind it. I'm just saying. You heard it here.
I'm working all my contacts, working all my extensive Middle Eastern contacts to see what I can do there. But yeah, no, I mean, it does seem like it's I guess it always seems like a scary circumstance when, you have a country like Israel that sort of lives on threats like this, nuclear threats, war threats, invasion threats, everything they do on an everyday basis towards Palestinians. But it does feel, in the context of the shifting sands of the world, this is yet another issue, Rania, where you just think, like, what's going to happen next,
That's what everyone here is wondering. But also, I want to just throw one thing out there before we move on: is Lebanon is desperate for fuel. Like they need those gas fields for their own people, because Lebanon hasn't been able to buy fuel. because of the central bank governor, who's basically like a U.S. ally, refusing to essentially fund the state electricity company. So
Wow.
people here are living on 2 hours of electricity a day. It's pretty devastating circumstances that you don't really see anywhere else in the world, except for maybe Sri Lanka these days, and a couple other places that are running out of fuel. But anyways, all of this, that to be said, by the Europeans looking to Israel to basically use Lebanese gas to replace Russian gas, which doesn't even seem like it's a thing you can do, by the way. I don't think there's enough gas to replace what Russia was giving to Europe, is also just denying people in the Middle East what belongs to them once again.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's so many different issues, and Turkey, Cyprus, Egypt, all also involved in this, but more to come. And I think, more to come from Rania Khalek on the electricity situation in the Middle East. One of the many reasons you want to make sure that you are subscribed, that you hit the bell, that you are following us at BT Newsroom across all social media platforms. Just follow us everywhere you can. Hit as many alerts as you possibly can, because we got tons of great stuff coming for you. But now we want to turn the page to another very important story, one that unfortunately is not making a lot of international news, and that is the story in Swaziland of the struggle there for democracy against the monarch, King Maswati. And we are very happy to be joined, honored, I should say, by Pius Vilagati, who's the international secretary of the Communist Party of Swaziland that's been right on the front lines of all these struggles. Pius, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's really an honor.
Well, I'll tell you, the honor is all ours. And maybe before we get into some of the specific issues, I think there are probably many people watching who haven't heard a lot about what's going on in Swaziland, what the nature of the struggle is. I know it's been about a year since, a real major sort of wave of uprisings have started. But maybe just to give some context about the country and why folks feel the need to rise up in such numbers with such steadfastness.
Well, firstly, the fact of the matter is that Swaziland remains the last absolute monarchy in Africa. It is one of the last absolute monarchies in the world. So that in itself has meant that a large chunk of the economy, year in, year out, goes to the monarchy, goes to the royal family. And the royal family lives a luxurious lifestyle, while about 70% of the people live below the poverty line. People are impoverished in the midst of many luxurious Rolls-Royce vehicles, luxurious Mercedes-Benz, and luxurious BMWs that are used by the monarchy. People do not even have the basic needs for them to survive each day. And therefore, this has been deepening. In 2019, the King Mswati III, he bought about 19 Rolls-Royce vehicles for himself, for his 15 wives and his children, and for his mother, who is the queen in Swaziland. So people have been seeing these things happening year in, year out, where the royal family is able to amass a great deal of wealth which, by the way, belongs to the people of Swaziland. And the people are saying, it is not right that you use our wealth for your personal and your family enrichment while we remain poor. As things stand, the health care system is collapsed. People cannot access even the most basic of medical drugs. They cannot get treatment because the budget goes to the real, and only small little crumbs go to the people. So the people decided that in 2021, enough is enough. But this was not the first time, of course, that the people wanted to do away with the system. It's been a system that has been going on from 12 April 1973, which was imposed by the late Sopuza II, who is the father of the current king. Now, things have been deteriorating from then and until now, when people started to say enough is enough with the entire monarchy system in itself. And those are basically the things or the basic realities which led to the uprising in 2021.
Can you tell us a bit about what the response has been to that, to the mass demonstrations, and maybe a little bit about some of the risks that come along with pushing back? Like, what did people like you have to deal with in terms of this absolute monarchy when you stand up and challenge it?
Well, there's a, although it has the Constitution 2000, it's still according to the 1973 King's Proclamation, where political parties remain banned and political activity remains banned. To differ with the ruling elite is a crime in Swaziland. It doesn't matter if you belong to a political party or not, or if you are a member of a union. You are guilty by raising political demands in Swaziland. And this has meant that the security forces are able to arrest anyone they suspect as a leader of either a community or an organization, including a union, and arrest them on trumped up charges. Sometimes they arrest and keep you in jail for an indefinite time. And the violence that has been meted on the people. For instance, last year, we had over 70 people getting shot and killed by the army and the police. And I must state that last year, of course, it was the first time that the regime unleashed the army on the people. And since then, the army has not been called back to barracks. So standing up against the regime gets you killed, gets you arrested, gets you tortured, gets you victimized by different institutions of Swaziland. It could be your college, your university administration. It could be the chief in the rural areas. Remember, Swaziland is about 70 to 77% rural. So a great chunk of the people live in the rural areas where the rule of chiefs is supreme. And the chiefs in the communities, they they rule or administrate the communities on behalf of the monarchy. So the monarchy is literally a feudal lord. If you were to speak about the feudal lords in Europe, you'd have to go back centuries. That's where we are at in Swaziland.
Well, I really appreciate that. And, one thing that it just brings to mind is, regionally, internationally, who is backing the king. I mean, I know that, in 2021, the protest at one point became so large and so intense that the king fled the country. And I just feel, for him to be the last absolute monarch, to be putting this brutal repression, on those who are standing up, that he must be useful to somebody somewhere in the sort of broader imperialist world. And so I'm curious, both sort of in the continent and internationally, where is the king drawing his strength from, where he feels he can so wantonly, act this way?
To understand these current circumstances, it is important that we go back to history. The current monarchy is, for all practical purposes, a creation of British colonialism. When the British left Swaziland in 1968, and thus Swaziland gained independence, they left the current ruling royal family, and they left all the minerals, the natural minerals, to him. And therefore, from there, the relationship between the Swazi regime and British government still continues. And in addition to that, the role of apartheid South Africa is important to understand the current system. System which advised the late King Sobhuza II in the 1960s to ensure that when independence comes, he has power. And although the elections in 1967, the parliamentary elections, were under a constitution which allowed multi-party participation, the king's political party won all the seats with the backing of apartheid regime. And apartheid's interest at that time was to crush the liberation movement of South Africa, which had exiles in Swaziland and other countries. And that is why they supported the royal family, because they knew that the king was going to support apartheid, even though he was giving the image of supporting the South African liberation movement. But 5 years after that, out of 24 seats in parliament, the King's party lost 3 seats to the opposition. The opposition, which was the Ngwana National Liberation Movement, was the one which had made it clear that it was going to support the South African liberation struggle. In that instance, the apartheid regime advised again the ruling monarch to abolish political parties so that he maintains his supreme power. So he had that support from outside. So this is why the system, some people misunderstand it as a truly African system. It is not an African system. It is an imposed system created by colonialism and apartheid. And with the entrenchment of the absolute monarchy system, other players also came into the picture. When Swaziland gained independence in 1968, they continued to they became friends or allies with Israel and also with Taiwan, who remain the regime's supporters even today, militarily, economically, and otherwise. And again, the USA is also another supporter of the regime in Swaziland. And the approach of the USA, besides the companies that they've placed in Swaziland for investment to assist Swaziland with its economy, it is also interventions in places where aspects where the royal family has destroyed the economy. For instance, in the education system and the healthcare system, this is where the USA comes in and gives this foreign aid to them. And of course, the European Union is also another player in Swaziland, particularly in the sugar industry. And they help to build infrastructure for Swaziland in order to give the impression that Swaziland is at least developing, when we know for a fact that it is the EU helping the regime to remain afloat. Because if you were to remove all these support systems, this regime would fall the next hour. Forget about the next day. The next hour it will fall. So with the movement last year and still continuing, the support, as I've mentioned, the chiefs before, the support from the chiefs in the rural communities. For a long time, they helped to sustain the monarchy because they were able to control the rural community from uprising. But in 2021, the struggles spread for the first time in the history of our struggles in Swaziland, spread to the rural communities. And now that is when the last point which the king had, and he was forced now to release the army. So what he has now is the last resort, which is the army. And if the army is destroyed or is defeated, then the system is going to fall.
Let me just ask you this quickly as a final question. So where are things now? What is the state of the movement? What do those of you on the ground have planned to keep things moving forward?
What's been happening right now is that particularly the youth, which is the one that has been really in the forefront of the struggle, and that movement has been growing, particularly the youth movement. The Communist Party of Swaziland held its summer school last year in December, our annual summer school. And we continue to say that we need the communist youth to the front to lead these struggles, because Swaziland is amongst the youngest populations in Swaziland. And as such, any revolution that's going to take place is going to be led by the youth For it to be successful, it necessarily needs the youth to be at the forefront. And so because we are responding to real material conditions that are happening in our society. And what we're seeing right now is that the pressures that the youth are facing because of the system. Already today we had already 2 students confirmed that they died by suicide. And these are the issues that they've been thinking about. These are the issues that are facing the people of Swaziland. And therefore, the student movement is a strong movement in our country. It is a uniting force. And we are working together with other forces to unite the people. And we need a final onslaught, because the only thing that we need now is change. And that 2022 must be a year of change, Swaziland.
Well, much appreciation to you for joining us from the ground.
And
Pius Vilagati, the International Secretary of the Communist Party of Swaziland. Very good to have you here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you, sir. Long live the people.
Well, very, very
Wow.
intense struggle there, you know, and I hope folks continue to follow up and continue to follow it. One thing I will say, you know, many of the organizations, Communist Party, Pudimo, EFF, the Students' National Union of Swaziland, they're actually very active on social media. So it's actually not hard at all to follow what they have. They're struggling very hard. So glad we were able to do that. Glad we were able to talk about it.
Indeed, indeed.
You know, it used to
Yeah.
be King Maswati, final thing I'll say, would go every year to Atlanta to meet with Coke executives, you know, because they take the sugar from there to put it in Coke.
Wow.
Be that as it may, we will take a pivot here to, you know, the critical issue facing us all. That's the climate catastrophe that I guess we're living in. I don't think it's coming at this point. Very honored to be joined as we continue the show by Kelly Stone, Senior Policy Analyst on Climate Change with ActionAid USA. Kelly, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, the pleasure is all ours. And I wanted to start with the Supreme Court ruling, the West Virginia, the EPA v. West Virginia. I think some people probably heard generally there was a Supreme Court ruling that was very bad for the planet. But if you could just give us some, you know, a capsule view of what this case was.
Sure. And I think that actually to start is the fact that the court ruled on this at all was pretty radical. This case was nominally about the Clean Power Plan, which is a program that was proposed in the Obama administration, never implemented, and that the Biden administration was extremely clear they did not plan to implement. But the Supreme Court decided to take the case anyway. So the fact that they were ruling on it at all, I think, speaks to exactly how radical of a decision it was. It was somewhat more limited than we might have feared initially. And so, you know, the ruling is very specific to power plants under a very specific provision in the Clean Power Plan. So it doesn't end the Biden administration's ability to use either the Clean Air Act, or any of their other executive authorities to act on climate change. But it is a major tool that the Supreme Court preemptively took off the table.
And what do you think this means in terms of, I mean, we have this reactionary court full of right-wingers who have an agenda, who are, I guess, going to serve for life. What does this mean moving forward? Because it also just tells us what the Supreme Court is willing to rule on. So should this have us maybe concerned about what other climate-related issues they might be ruling on, which would be, of course, in favor of corporations and of making the air dirtier and of making it more difficult to actually do anything about climate change?
I do think we should be concerned. I mean, this is, you know, this particular ruling was somewhat limited, as I said, but that does not mean that they aren't going to come back and keep chipping away at, you know, the ability to confront this crisis, which is so central. So I do think that it speaks to the urgency of pushing on all of the different tools that we have to try to address climate change.
You know, Kelly, it feels almost like there's like a domino effect aspect to it. I mean, you have the Supreme Court on one hand, excuse me, you have the failure in Congress of major climate legislation. I mean, it almost, it just, you hate to say that anything is locked in or whatever it may be, but it does feel like at this stage in the game, given the time scale of this, that the U.S. is very much behind the eight ball in terms of the progress that needs to be made to actually have significant reductions in carbon emissions by, 2030, much less 2050.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. And I think that it's something, and I think that, we're heading into a summer likely of climate disasters, which, and it's a lot to confront. The failures in Congress, we haven't seen the level of action that we'd like from the Biden administration. We see the Supreme Court preemptively reaching out in this way. And really, but what I will say though is that we shouldn't let this anger turn us towards helplessness, because it does matter what we do now. Every bit of a degree that we can stop makes a difference. The 1.5 degree goal, which is what a lot of people are rightfully focused on, the window for that is slamming in our face really rapidly. But that doesn't mean that we have the option of turning away from this challenge. It's fundamental to all of us. So finding a way forward still does matter, because, over 1.5 is unthinkable, but 2 is much worse than 1.7. And 2 is still better than 3. So we need to find a way forward.
No, I think that's a good point. One thing I just want to ask on a follow-up on that too, could you talk a little bit about the differences between those? Because I think sometimes, people are thinking like the temperature or water or whatever. So if it's like 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, like how big of a difference could that really be? But obviously, as you'd say, it's catastrophic.
It doesn't help that it's in Celsius too. And I think that, we're seeing more data coming out about this. But what's important to remember is the impacts that we're seeing right now are what we're seeing at about 1.1. So this is where we're already seeing, huge droughts, in the West, increased, hurricane intensity, rain pattern changes. So that's 1.1. So 1.5 is sort of where things start tipping into sort of the more cataclysmic. That's when, you start seeing whole regions really struggling with agriculture. And as we get closer and closer to 2, that becomes more profound. Over 3 degrees Celsius is really sort of an unthinkable outcome, frankly, because it's just not a planet that any one of us would even remotely recognize. Wow. And I should say that also, it's hard to actually put numbers on this, right, but we are talking about lives. More, people are dying right now. More people will be dying at 1.5. But as you start increasing, it's lives being lost and ruined.
And what, the trajectory we're on right now, where does that take us? What are the sort of time frames?
Yeah. So the rough. So I will say that right now, essentially, if every commitment implemented according to the IPCC, we'd be looking at just under 3. I think it's something like 2.8. Now, that is based on a lot of business as usual, frankly. But what I will say is that a pathway to 1.5 is no new fossil fuel infrastructure, phasing out some of the current fossil fuel infrastructure early, before the quote unquote end of its useful life. That means peaking globally in the next couple of years and globally cutting emissions in half by 2030, which we would say that that means the U.S. should be doing much more than just in half, considering our historical contribution to the problem and that we're one of the richest countries in the world, that we have a much larger fair share. Mm. So we're pretty far from that pathway right now.
Wow.
That is a terrifying prospect.
Yes,
wow.
It is.
Yeah.
Wow. I read the most interesting article this morning in The Guardian about carbon capture pipelines. I'd never heard of this before in my life, which is why it blew me away. For people who don't know, I guess they're building all these giant pipelines to ship carbon and blast it into rocks in North Dakota, and it's going through Iowa. People are very upset because it's going to cause problems to where they live. And I guess the ultimate sort of thrust of my question is because I know, Biden's always hyping carbon capture. A lot of people are always talking about it. Is this a time where, well, I don't know, maybe it is good. And if it is, you should tell me. But it almost feels like this is another one of these kind of last ditch efforts to prevent any real attempts to curtail fossil fuels by saying, no, don't worry about it. We'll just blast it into some rock in North Dakota and it's all going to be fine.
Yeah, I definitely, and I think the talk of the technologies around carbon capture and storage and other geoengineering technologies is going to increase as impacts get more significant and people realize exactly how late we are. There is going to be an impulse to reach for a magical solution that's going to fix things. And carbon capture and storage is not it. Particularly the pipeline you're talking about is connected to corn ethanol plants. So they are creating corn ethanol and then capturing that CO2 and then piping it, across several states to North Dakota, supposedly, and then saying that they're going to store it instead of use it for enhanced oil recovery. First of all, most of when you see this talked about in the scientific community, they're talking about trying to remove carbon from the atmosphere or, attach it to coal plants to extend their coal plant's life, which is not what we'd see as a real climate solution at all. But when it's connected to corn ethanol, we're just further propping up what's already a failed climate solution.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of these wild ideas are meant to just, continue to do what we're doing while assuming that some miracle technology is going to be developed that can just fix everything. But I'm curious. I'm curious, on a sort of more global scale here, you do see something also concerning taking place, which is obviously with the war in Ukraine causing the price of oil to surge and a desperate kind of search to replace the gas in Europe that is no longer coming from Russia. You have the Europeans now saying that nuclear energy is sustainable and other things are sustainable so that it can fit into their sort of green policies around climate change, so that they continue to extract and use various forms of fossil fuels while saying it's clean. How detrimental will this sort of behavior be to the challenges we face in terms of climate change?
It's huge and really fundamental because especially because of how long we have waited to start acting on this, the types of transformations we need to really meet the challenge for climate change are really profound. And so there is all the temptation in the world, frankly, to keep reaching for that, magic solution that's going to let us continue to ignore the problem, and there are real crises in the short term where, food prices are skyrocketing in large part because of what's happening in Ukraine right now. And there is a real need to find immediate solutions to help people right away. But we shouldn't be locking in these dirty energy sources further. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in this problem, frankly, because, this fossil fuel is largely propping up Putin's invasion as well. So we really should be, we can't continue to lock in these false solutions.
One quick thing that I just want to ask, before we go, and, you already mentioned the issue of fair share. Obviously, we're in budget season here in the United States. Correct me if I'm wrong here. I believe the Biden administration is proposing something like $11 billion in climate finance in their initial proposal. Of course, the way you read it, they'll say it's the most whatever and however many times. Where does that stand in terms of what we should be doing and what should that look like? Because I think, we're seeing a lot of countries in our hemisphere, in the Caribbean and other places really calling for the U.S. to take more action on this so that they can really make some changes.
Yes. So I think first the challenge with the Biden administration's commitment of $11.4 billion is, first of all, not all of that is grants. They're saying now some of that is going to be loans. which further increases climate debt. But it's also not clear that they're actually going to be able to get Congress to deliver, unfortunately, because Congress did not come through at all in the last fiscal year. And the current bill does not meet that, that they're considering right now for FY fiscal year 23 does not meet that 11.4 billion. But I mean, again, the 11.4 is still quite short of where we need to be. For a fair share, we would say by 2030, in addition to increasing our domestic mitigation to be more like a 70% reduction instead of the 50% that Biden has proposed, we would then say that we'd need to do even more of that in climate finance to really meet our fair share, which would be something like 800 billion over the decade. So, ramping up to that would require much more than 11.4 billion a year. But again, we still haven't completed our initial pledge to the Green Climate Fund, which dates back to 2014. And the Green Climate Fund's the major multilateral funder for climate finance globally, set up under the UN Convention, and that serves the Paris Agreement. And we're late. So the Biden administration likes to talk a big game about being a climate leader, and I think that at their best moments they want to be that, but they haven't actually delivered on the action to claim that title.
Mm-hmm. Well, Kelly, we really appreciate you joining us here. Kelly Stone, Senior Policy Analyst at ActionAid USA. Thanks so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, so that's depressing.
Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, it just, to me, I was thinking about that this morning, actually reading this article in The Guardian, which I can highly recommend, because the thrust of the article is that there's this, very interesting coalition of like farmers, indigenous folks, just people generally concerned about the climate in Iowa, also Nebraska, other areas where this is going to happen, coming together to fight this. And you think about Keystone XL, you think about what happened at Standing Rock, you think about what happened at Line 3 last year. I mean, really, the only climate progress that's being made are when people are ultimately, in the best traditions of the civil rights movement, doing civil disobedience, putting their bodies on the line, just saying like, okay, if you're not going to do anything in the halls of Congress, we're just not going to let you build this stuff. And if you want to try, you're going to have to go through us. And I feel that that's the only real hope at this moment is, people like that in Iowa right now.
Because capital doesn't care. They don't care about the consequences. Like capitalism does not care about the consequences of climate change. That, showing that if the like fire tornadoes that are being created from, seriously, I mean, the B-roll we were showing.
Yeah.
The B-roll we were showing of just like what looked like what hell should look like.
Yeah.
With just everything on fire. Yeah. Like if that isn't enough to get this system to change, then obviously it's not going to do it on its own.
Yeah.
And so what you're saying is absolutely correct. Unless you like stand in the way of it, it's just going to keep, destroying.
Totally. Absolutely. Well, a good fact to reflect on all of our own agency. Well, we're going to make a segue here. You sort of alluded to this point here, Rania, and that's some of the ongoing fallout, if you will, from the Russia-Ukraine war, and that is the accession of Sweden and Finland, formerly neutral countries, to NATO. Well, I don't think they're in yet, but they've signed the thing to get in to NATO. They've ascended to the process, but I think it could still be blocked. So I don't really understand exactly where that's at. But nevertheless, we are very happy to be joined by the editor-in-chief of BreakThrough News, Ben Becker, who is becoming just go-to on the Eastern European crisis. Ben, thank you so much for being back with us. Dr.
Thanks
Ben
for having
Becker.
me again.
Listen, pleasure is all ours. That shows you how egalitarian BreakThrough is, guys, that even the editor-in-chief is happy to be back. We don't, this is not a big I, little you place.
It took me about maybe even 2 years on the freedom side.
Yeah, Ben was convinced that there was like a conspiracy against having him on for a while. I still have no idea. I don't know. I don't have that knowledge. I'm not in New York, so.
Yeah, well, we are.
I don't know what's going on over there.
So, what's going on in Europe is the question. Ben, I guess in a way, this is not all that surprising, but it does seem notable that this has been one of the sort of fallout elements of what's happening in Ukraine is that NATO seems to be becoming strengthened as more of these Western European regimes rally to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the tagline or the banner that everyone is going with is that, well, NATO's back, the EU's back, the West is back, Europe is back. You know, the imperialism is back, and we're back in the saddle. We've been losing, we've been slipping, but now we're strong again. That's the message that they want to put out right now. And I don't think there's I think in a way it's only deep and there's big contradictions underneath the surface. But obviously this war has been a great opportunity for the military of the world, for the United States, for Western Europe. And this has been a moment to reconsolidate some alliances, the Atlantic alliances that were in. And there was this overall gradual drift, which I think is happening with Russia, China. There was kind of an unstoppable, perfectly understandable from an economic standpoint, a connection that had been deepening ever since the financial crisis of 2008 between China with West. Ukraine has been a crisis that is also an opportunity for the West. You know how they say, like, don't let a good crisis go to waste, don't let a good war go to waste, basically. And this has been a way to accelerate the decoupling that the United States would like to see, China and Russia. And it's a way of bringing some countries like Sweden and Finland really formally into the fold. Of course, Sweden had really already been integrated into a lot of the Western security architecture. Sweden had. Finland was more a more classically neutral country, has a history of war with Russia, and the Soviet Union going back many decades. Also had been after that, starting in the 1930s, it had a mutual assistance and cooperation agreement with the Soviet Union. It has an over 800 miles with Russia. So it had been a classically neutral country, trading with both sides. So to bring Finland in completely into this Western alliance is a pretty big deal, I'd say. It's not to say that they were truly neutral before. Finland and Sweden both participated, for instance, in the wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan. But from a geographic standpoint, if you were to pull open a map, it basically means the Baltic Sea, which is extremely important for Russia, has been converted into a NATO lake. And there's just a few little parts that Russia is connected to, whether it's St. Petersburg and then a little territory called Kaliningrad that are now not in NATO, but basically all of the other Baltic states and now the Scandinavian states are brought into NATO. So it also strengthens this military encirclement of Russia, and it changes the military posture of NATO around Russia. And I think that's what, that is quite grave, and actually in a way is even more grave than just the accession of Sweden and Finland, the number of troops that are now being amassed for immediate combat with Russia.
So, it's interesting because obviously this war started because of NATO expansion, right? Of trying to bring Ukraine into the NATO fold. And now that the war, now that Russia invaded Ukraine over this, the West is doubling down. And then I've seen some critics of, obviously what Russia's done saying, oh, like Russia was so dumb. They invaded Ukraine to stop Ukraine from joining NATO, but now two other countries have joined NATO. Are Sweden and Finland joining NATO like as big of a security threat as a country like Ukraine? And if not, why not?
I'd say not. I mean, if we really just draw a balance sheet, I'd be interested in what you two think. You're both experts also on this. But I think that, Ukraine is a country through which the Soviet Union and Russia have been attacked. Those areas on multiple times, those lands. The Baltic Sea, from a military standpoint, of course, there has been conflict and war there too, but I don't think it's quite at the same scale. And I'd say from a sort of cultural, ethnic, linguistic standpoint, obviously the connections between Finland and Sweden and Finland and Russia are not the same as the Ukrainian-Russian relationship. So it's not as central, no, to to the Russian government. So in that sense, it's not the same. You know, I think it's a little too early to draw the full balance sheet of the war. You know, and this war is likely to continue into the winter, I would say, or even longer. I mean, I could be wrong. In a way, I'm certainly hoping I'm wrong. But from both sides, you can see why there's sort of a strategic reason to actually extend the war rather than to enter into sincere negotiations at this point to bring things to an end. So, you know, this is a new era in global politics that has been initiated. It's shifting the alliances and the balance of power all over the world. How that all shakes out, which side is the quote winner, which in a way is a very simplistic way of even looking at it. I think, you know, that's sort of just calling balls and strikes, looking at world conflicts. Instead, we're trying to understand how the world is reshaping. It's a little too early to say, but certainly if the standpoint of Russia, for those who say we have to prevent our military encirclement, the military encirclement is indeed strengthening around Russia. And I think that the economic pain of the sanctions has not fully hit Russia. On the other hand, the economic pain of the natural gas shutoffs have not fully hit Western Europe. So sort of which side ends up bleeding the most is basically the main question at this point from like a military standpoint. So yeah, I mean, there's 300,000 more combat-ready troops that are going to be basically brought up to Russia's borders from 40,000 to 300,000 from NATO. Now, mind you, let's go back to February. The whole idea of like amassing troops on the border was considered a huge scandal when Russia did it. And people said, this could bring us to war. This is extremely dangerous. And yet when NATO wants to bring 300,000 troops up to Russia's borders, that's purely defense. You know, and I think that these are the ways in which the U.S. media consumer is hearing words like the defensive posture of NATO, and they just declare it a defensive posture, and so therefore it's defensive. But in fact, this is very different. This is like when you bring 300,000 troops all along a country's border. You know, I wouldn't even call it a tripwire anymore. It's almost like we're making it much more likely of a regional and in fact global and potentially nuclear war every time we expand the number of troops that are brought up to Russia's border.
No, I think it's a good point, and I think it's a good question. I mean, I would say I think the real fear was the opposite way. You know, I don't think there's any real, and you know, Putin spoke to this just the other day. I forget exactly which international forum he was, but he said he wasn't that concerned about the Finland-Sweden accession, and said if they want to do that, they want to do that. We don't have the same. It's not the same issue. We don't have the same historical, cultural ties. The point Ben mentioned about the previous wars, so we don't view it as a threat. So that's certainly what the Russians think. But I think neutrality was a threat to the West. I mean, you know, if you read the most recent Foreign Affairs magazine,
yes,
there's an article in there.
Because you hate yourself.
What's that?
Is it because you hate yourself?
Yeah.
These days, foreign affairs.
You have to read what the enemy is saying, Rania. You have to.
You do. We do it so you don't have to.
Thank you. Yes, that's, again, patreon.com/breakthrough news. But, you know, the article is by, you know, a top fellow at CFR and also the guy's the head of the Chicago Committee on Global Affairs. And the whole piece is about how the U.S. needs to form this G12 that is basically a hardcore Cold War bloc of all the European countries, Japan and Australia, against Russia and China combined, and that they should do it explicitly, they should start drawing the lines more sharply, and that they should try to force a confrontation with every single country in the world having to choose, are you with Russia and China, or are you with this new quote-unquote G12? And so I think just the very idea of having any country in Europe be quote-unquote neutral is very dangerous to this concept of wanting to sharpen the spear in terms of the confrontation of Russia and China to try to maintain imperialism. I mean, you know, as it was famously said many years ago, right? You know, what's the real goal of NATO? To keep the Soviet Union out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. And it seems to be reverting to its exact original function.
I was going to say the exact same thing. I mean, I think when you look from the long view, what happens over the century? If Eurasia becomes an integrated economic and bloc, let alone a political bloc, where does that leave the U.S. as the global hegemon? It makes it essentially impossible. And in fact, the rules of globalization that the West had created ended up creating all these opportunities for precisely that to happen. So now they've actually had to unwind and roll back globalization because they actually want two separate world economies. They want two separate blocks now. And this is why I mean, from the standpoint of neutrality, obviously this war has ended the possibility of a lot of countries remaining neutral, which I think is where things were starting to go. If Germany has the Nord Stream pipeline, for instance, and is completely reliant on Russian natural gas, is it really possible that they're ever going to, go to war and have a major conflict with Russia? It makes it much less likely, and it creates the infrastructure that then, creates momentum for precisely that. So ending that pipeline was very important. Now Finland is going to come into the NATO camp. Ukraine, I think, obviously is going to end up, however the war ends, I think is fairly likely to end up in the EU as a Western aligned state. So from the standpoint of Russia's initial goal to have Ukrainian neutrality, I don't think that that's really on the table right now. Now, what the final shape of Ukraine is another question. So this whole era of globalization has now entered a completely new era, and it is like a new Cold War. And I think it's why you see countries like China, which has actually benefited from the rules of globalization, ironically, saying we oppose a Cold War mentality. And it's actually the US that's trying to force all countries into a Cold War mentality. Very interesting that the NATO summit took special shots at China. And it basically wanted to link Russia and China as much as possible. It says, hey, they're strategic partners, they're pushing authoritarianism, et cetera, et cetera. These were countries that up to a few years ago were begging China to invest its surpluses back into their economies, that had very active trade with China. Germany, I think, actually had traded more to China than China sold to it, one of the few countries in Western Europe. And now they're basically identifying China as a strategic enemy of NATO. China, just to remind people, is not in the North Atlantic at all. So why is NATO doing that? It's obviously that it's trying to reshape global politics along the lines of a new Cold War.
And as all this takes place, one thing we've talked about a lot on various breakthrough programs is who does this benefit? It doesn't benefit Europe. It actually harms Europe pretty seriously. It benefits American elites, I guess. But at the end of the day, like, Europe is just shooting itself in the feet. It's slitting its own throat. It really shows you that it's really just the US in charge, and it's forcing people to be on its team, even when it's against their own interests. And I actually think, when you talk about forcing this sort of like forcing this world on everybody where you have to choose sides, it seems to me we've already seen that a significant portion of the world refuses to do that.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. And that's been the other side effect. I mean, we've been talking about Europe so far, but actually it seems that this war has been counterproductive from the standpoint of US hegemony in Asia and Africa, and certainly in Latin America. So these are the kinds of things that they'll look back on and say, did we make a mistake or not? And I think it's important to recognize that the US elite are not some omniscient, all-knowing, all-powerful people who always make decisions in their, for their best long-term interest. They make lots of mistakes based on hubris and arrogance, which itself are come from being the empire, being on top for so long. You just figure you can do whatever you want and everybody else will fall in line. They're realizing those days are over. They're definitely over, and they're not coming back. Maybe it can work in Western Europe and work in a few countries here and there, but on a global scale, it's not going to work. And look at the economy. I mean, you raised it. Who is it really benefiting? Mm-hmm. I mean, 28% of Americans approve of Joe Biden's handling of the economy. His never lower. They're lower than where Trump's approval ratings were. So, what exactly, he got a little bump in approval ratings during the beginning part of the Ukraine crisis and that's why I think he got kind of like really interested in pumping up Ukraine, because it would help his poll numbers. But ultimately people moved on from Ukraine when they realized they couldn't afford gasoline anymore. They couldn't find baby formula. They couldn't find their most basic needs. And then people are really going to evaluate the government based on that. And who does this policy ultimately serve? Okay, now Sweden and Finland are going to buy more weapons from the US. Great. How does that exactly help the US working class or the Finnish and Swedish working class for that matter? I mean, this is basically just helping military contractors. And ultimately, I think that all the governments that are following this policy are going to pay a heavy price politically because people are not going to just stand by it forever.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. I mean, and we're seeing the fallout in real ways, certainly all across Europe. I mean, one of the largest unions in Germany, the head said whole industries could collapse, not just for the short term, but forever if there's any more serious cut in the gas because, major industries are selling things. So if you have to shut down for 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, other competitors around the world are just going to jump in there. And so, he was talking about glass and all these different big industries in Germany could just be gone forever. And to show how bad it is, the German economy minister said today, well, if necessary, they will turn on Nord Stream 2 because they don't want to let the country completely collapse. So that would just be the most unbelievable backfiring of these sanctions, but that's where we are in the broader scheme of things.
Well, just remember when after the Soviet Union fell, there was actually many people in Germany in the German high command who were really considering whether Russia should not come into NATO. They said, look, yes, Russia's basically under our thumb. Russia's capitalistic. Russia wants our help. Why not bring them into NATO? And this was not really tolerated or even considered that much in the United States because once you brought Russia and Germany together, NATO would cease to become an instrument of U.S. Policy. NATO would then become an instrument of European policy, and they would follow European interests, which are not the same as U.S. corporate interests. And so actually, even a Russia then completely subordinated, a puppet Russia, could not even be brought into NATO because it's a big country, and it was assumed, probably correctly by the U.S., that once Russia gets on its feet and pursues a more nationalistic policy, it would be impossible for NATO to remain under the thumb of the United States. And so they created another program, the NATO Partners Program, to sort of not turn away Russia entirely, but to kind of create this other place. That's also where they put Finland, by the way. And Finland was another partner for peace or whatever this NATO thing was. That whole era is over. They brought Russia into the G8 also. Yes. And of course, they kicked them out over the Ukraine issue in 2014. So this is there was this sort of brief window where they were trying to figure this out. And obviously, they've decided for the foreseeable future that Russia is out, China is out. Great power conflict is what the world must prepare for, whether they want it or not.
Well, that's bleak, but it's where we are. So thankfully, the vast majority of the world doesn't agree with that. So, for those of us who don't agree with that here, we certainly aren't alone. Well, Ben Becker, Editor-in-Chief, BreakThrough News, as always, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you. Big fan of the Freedom Side. Big fan.
Thank God for that.
We'll have to have him back on at some point.
I think we have to. Dr. Ben Becker, very intelligent person, expert on U.S. immigration. Look for his book, Fall 2023, Spring 2024. Anyway, that will bring us to the end of the show. As always, Rania, I think we've covered a lot, and maybe the underlying factor of all of them is, it's going to take people acting to deal with any of this. Certainly, if you're waiting on anybody in the White House or Congress or the Supreme Court to do anything, you'll be waiting for a real long time.
Well, that's not true. I mean, they could read a poem or sing a song on the steps of the Capitol.
Unbelievable.
There's lots of Israeli poems that Nancy Pelosi she could sing the Israeli national anthem.
I know. Well, then you saw that she was there in the Vatican when she was sending out all these fundraising emails, and she's out in these luxurious places, watching different religious services and meeting the Pope and all of that, and it's just you couldn't be disrespect to the Pope, who obviously has much better politics than President Biden or Nancy Pelosi, but I mean the symbolism of it could not have been more ridiculous to be in some palace in Rome.
It's like during the COVID, the beginning of COVID. Remember her two $30,000 massive refrigerators full of so much ice cream.
Yeah,
I mean,
and I love Talenti, but it is the most expensive ice cream brand.
But the refrigerators too. Like, it was,
Why does she have two fridges? Yeah, there's a lot of questions there.
They were alone by itself. Each fridge was like $20,000 to $30,000, and I'm just like, man, people like can't go to work. They're freaking out. Like, this is before any stimulus check had gone out, and this woman is like on a late night show talking to a millionaire about her ice cream in front of her gorgeous.
And
like,
she's one of the richest members of Congress. That's actually truly why I believe she does have two fridges, like, all jokes aside, is probably because she has private chefs and people like that coming in and making meals.
Oh, yeah.
So they're probably storing a lot of stuff, moving things between, like a prep fridge and different things like that. But you want to have a lot of space when you have that kind of, money and those kind of people coming in and preparing stuff.
No, she's definitely got like a staff. Like, I think of the song in Annie when like Daddy Warbucks,
I knew that,
like, when she comes and they're like, we're gonna, and like everyone comes out and like there's just like a whole staff that just like lives at the house and works there. That's what Nancy Pelosi probably has.
Nancy Pelosi, the Daddy Warbucks of U.S. politics. You heard it from Rania Khalek.
Well, I like how she adopt me. No, but she didn't get rich by accident. I mean, like, her husband is just like happens to make lots of money from stocks. That, how did he know?
A lot of questions about that. But no one. A lot of questions.
Anyways, totally different topic. Just a reminder of how messed up our country is.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure.
Nancy. That lower third. Oh my God.
We've got a quick team. They're quick on their feet here at BreakThrough News. Shout out to Matt in the booth.
That is funny. Matt,
okay.
Good one.
Well, that is the end of this show. As I said at the very beginning, make sure that you hit subscribe. Make sure you hit the bell so you get the alerts. Go to patreon.com/breakthrough news. It's patreon.com/breakthrough news. Become a patron. We'd be very, very honored and privileged to have your patronage, and certainly very grateful as well. And of course, you can follow us at BT Newsroom across all your social media handles. But that'll do it for us today. But Ronnie and I will be back with you next week.
Revolution never turns and destroys everything that gets in its way.